Hey, welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackmon. I'm back after a little hiatus here of a few months. We're restarting our podcast now, and I have a really great guest here, Philip Goldberg, who is he's a special counsel for the Manufacturers Accountability Project that's affiliated with the National Association of Manufacturers, one of the wonderful trade associations for the business community in Washington, D.C. Phil, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much, David, for having me on this. This is fantastic. I really appreciate it.
You're so lucky to be living in Washington, D.C. at this moment in time, aren't you?
It's a little cold. Staying away from politics. I'll talk weather.
Yeah, there's never anything happening in the nation's capital during the general election. I swear, I wake up every morning and there's like 50 things I see immediately upon getting on X or and surfing the internet.
Right.
50 topics I'd like to write about. It's just unbelievable how
Yeah,
much is happening.
there's a lot going on, and trying to dig into and understand all the different things that are happening takes a lot of time because
Yeah,
there's so much below the surface that we, as casual observers, we can't really, we don't see. And it takes so much time to dig into all those different things that are going on right now. So it is a little bit
yeah.
exhausting, but it's, as they say, may you live in interesting times.
Yes, sir. Well, we're here to talk about an issue that's really dear to my heart. I've probably written half a dozen articles about this lawfare campaign that's being mounted by some left-wing NGOs and law firms and recruiting cities and counties and state governments to sue the industry over some pretty specious climate-related changes. But before we get into that, I just want to give you a few minutes to talk about your background and what the mission of the Accountability Project is.
Sure. Well, I appreciate again the opportunity to come on your podcast. So MAP, or the Manufacturer Accountability Project, started about 5 or 6 years ago at NAM because what the manufacturing community has been concerned about is sort of the you call it lawfare, but the use of the courts to sue companies, mostly manufacturers, over what are really social and political issues. They're not liability issues. But they think that there's value in going to the courts because it helps them, get media attention or try to, get money out of these manufacturers to pay for some of the issues that are going on. And so and these are often, issues that are well known, like climate change or, opioid, abuse or, firearm, concerns.
Yeah,
These are things that require significant attention. No one's undercounting what the impact of all these issues are. But the question is this a liability issue for the manufacturers, or is this a public policy issue that we need to be driving through legislatures and regulatory agencies? And there's a movement out there just to sue. It's this sort of the American litigiousness that that it sounded like the first step. Well, who do we get to sue for this problem? Well, sometimes lawsuits are not the answer, and so that's why we started the Manufacturers Accountability Project, because we understand we want to be part of the solution, we want to be part of the dialogue, but litigation and suing isn't always the answer, and that's what we're
yeah.
here to talk about.
Yeah, and it's not always the answer. And unfortunately, though, it happens a lot. I was having a conversation with our producer beforehand, talking about when I was with a company called Burlington Resources. We were an independent producer years ago, and any given month we would have over 1,000 pieces of litigation that company was having to deal with. From just employee complaints or royalty owner lawsuits, things like that, all the way up to major pieces of litigation, class action lawsuits brought by the federal government and state governments. And it becomes a real burden within these companies to
Right.
have to try to manage all of these lawsuits at a given time, right?
It is, and a lot of times, and I'll say this: I mean, the companies that I work for, my clients, if they injure someone, they're not in any way saying we shouldn't have to be liable for actually
Sure.
injuring somebody, but they shouldn't they shouldn't have to pay for people they haven't injured, and they shouldn't be paying for things that are just these larger society issues dealing with, external issues that related to products or other things that, that are often there's a criminal or there's some activity or there's a regulated structure around it or there's something else that is at issue here, but they just say, hey, let's just sue. And that's something that's of concern to all manufacturers, regardless of where you are, and what sector you're in. You only want to be sued when you actually did something that wrongfully caused somebody else's harm.
Yeah. Well, in this particular suite of lawsuits that I like to call a lawfare effort, because it's really a highly coordinated thing between the governments and the NGOs and the law firms. We've had several significant decisions in recent months in cases in Baltimore, New York State, City of Honolulu, and the most recent one in Anne Arundel County in what I'm forgetting now. Is it in Maryland?
It's in Maryland, yeah.
Yeah, in Maryland. And
And I'll say
what
actually
is
more recently, as we're taping this morning, the New Jersey trial court just dismissed the New Jersey state case. So
yeah. Oh
that's
man, I didn't
breaking
even
news.
see that today.
Yeah.
I'm so overwhelmed with stuff to write. I didn't even see that. I'm gonna have to go look it up. So what is, I mean, the reality is, even though they're costing companies a lot of money, uh, these plaintiffs are not having a lot of success in the courts, are they?
They're not. And that's not always their goal. Their
Yeah.
goal is often to bring the litigation, to use the litigation to grab media attention. Ultimately, if they can, win some of these cases, obviously they'd like to do that. But this is, if you go back and, sometimes, context is important. This litigation, the idea of suing energy companies for climate change and saying you caused climate change and therefore you should have to pay us or you should have to do X, Y, or Z through the courts, started about 20 years ago with a case called AEP versus Connecticut, and there were a few other cases that were filed at the same time. And AEP versus Connecticut went up to the Supreme Court in 2011, and the court said, no, this is not a liability issue. We've got federal agencies like the EPA to deal with this, and that's a good thing. We don't want judges doing this on an ad hoc case by case basis. And they also said this was something of special federal interest, and that it would be inappropriate to use any kind of state law to govern emissions and climate change issues.
Right.
So you had a group that got together the next year in 2012 in La Jolla, what's called the La Jolla Conference, and they published their report on it. It's not like I'm saying anything that's not available online or that they didn't say themselves, but they decided that they wanted to still use the court to try to drive their policy agenda on the climate. And so what they did is they just looked at AEP, which is a federal law case targeting mostly utility companies. So they were the users of energy, or generators of energy, but users of oil and gas. They were, it was, different legal theories and all of that. And they said, let's just try it, bring a state case and let's sue the energy producers and let's, kind of mess with the legal theory. So it just doesn't look like AEP versus Connecticut, even though we're trying to do the exact same thing. And so the first court that ruled on this of any significance was the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, and hearing New York City's climate case, and they said this is just AEP versus Connecticut all over again. And they said this is not like we're not being fooled here. And it was a great opinion. They kind of went through all the legal theories. They went through why this is it's kind of AEP redux, and it said you can't just move the deck chairs around. It's the same.
Yeah.
And as you said, over the past year, we've now gotten rulings out of Delaware, Baltimore, Anne Arundel County, Maryland, this morning, New Jersey, and the state of Delaware. I think I said Delaware already. And I might be missing one or two. Oh, and New York City again. So New York City took even though they were rejected by the Second Circuit, they filed yet another lawsuit to try to go to their state courts instead of the federal courts. And the state court just a couple weeks ago said, no, this is for the same reason Second Circuit said it doesn't fly here. So you have all these courts are saying this is not a liability inducing event. This is not about, selling oil and gas to us is not a liability inducing event. What we do with climate change, and everybody agrees, climate change is something we need to deal with. It's incredibly important. So we feel the very same way, but it's what are we going to do about it, and where's the right place to drive those solutions? On the
Yeah.
other side of the ledger, you have the Hawaii Supreme Court that said this case can go forward. And the defendants appealed that, the oil and gas companies appealed that to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided not to hear the case. And so, that will, at least go forward at some level. And then you've
Isn't
got,
that it? I'm trying to remember. Isn't that in a county court, back to a county court now?
yeah,
Or
it's the city and county of Honolulu is the
right.
plaintiff in the case. And so it would go back to, state court in Hawaii. And then the Boulder trial court followed the Hawaii case, not the other cases. And so the Boulder Supreme Court, I mean, the Colorado Supreme Court decided they would hear that case. And so there's a hearing just in a few days on on that one. And
Yeah.
so, if you start looking at the ledger, things are clearly, working in our trending, and kind of what we've been saying is that these are not liability inducing events. This is not a state law issue. State law can't control emissions and govern emissions all around the world in other states. That's only federal law can do that. And that's why, these courts have been saying that, these cases, they've been, dismissing these cases.
Well, I mean, you do have to, I guess, give the lawyers and the plaintiffs credit for being creative in in how they try to frame these cases. The city and county of Honolulu actually brought the claim under the state's consumer protection laws, right?
Right.
Claiming false advertising over emissions, what is supposed to be a climate emissions issue, and seeking damage under consumer protection laws. And just the kind of outside this, you see a similar strategy happening in California, where Rob Bonta, the attorney general there, has brought a case against ExxonMobil on plastics litigation, claiming false advertising on behalf of on the part of ExxonMobil, which I'm not expecting you to comment on, but it's just to make the point that they're trying to they realize, I think, they don't really have a case on the emissions question. I mean, Hawaii's out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. If any emissions did cause climate change from the oil and gas industry, it's coming from all over the world. You're out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You can't say it's all because of some company that owns a refinery on Honolulu. And so I think they realize, don't they, that they don't really have legitimate claim on the emissions question. So they're trying to attach it to these other state and local statutes to try to make a money claim. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but that's how it seems to me.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. I mean, I've said it's kind of like legal spaghetti being thrown at the wall to see if anything sticks. These first cases were brought under federal public nuisance law. Then AP versus Connecticut said no to that. Then they tried state public nuisance law, and that was quickly kind of looked at and said this isn't a public nuisance case. And then they said, okay, well, what we're really saying is that that they didn't tell us the truth, or they downplayed, or they did. So they started bringing them under Consumer Protection Act. There's some cases that are brought under state RICO, saying that there's some grand conspiracy. There's others. I mean, like, they really are trying anything that they can just to get past these motions to dismiss and be able to wage the litigation, because, again, as we talked about before, they find value in just being able to talk about the litigation, get the media coverage, and do all of that, and apply pressure through lawsuits. But at the end of the day, this isn't about, and this is what the New Jersey court said today. It's not about how these cases are characterized. It's not about how artfully pleaded these cases are. All these cases are about trying to govern and impose liability on worldwide emissions, the global production and promotion and sale of these fuels. And that's beyond the role of any state law, whether it's a state Consumer Protection Act law, whether it's a state public nuisance law, whether it's any of these things. And so that's why the courts are saying it doesn't matter how much legal spaghetti you throw at the wall, none of this is going to stick.
Well, you mentioned it a minute ago. you understand why they're going to the courts. Okay. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but it does take away resources from what could otherwise be. I mean, if you could focus on, because this is a problem everyone is focused on working on, right?
Right.
And climate change, and people, everyone's trying to work on an issue that's important to society in a constructive way. But this is not a constructive way to do it. And you would think eventually, after you get poured out of enough courts, you might back up and try to reassess the strategy. But it just seems to me, anyway, as an observer out from outside, that it just continues to multiply. That the number of suits, they're bringing in more plaintiffs all the time, more
Right.
jurisdictions. How do we ever get to an end to all this? Is there ever going to be an end?
Well, there's a lot you said there, so I'll try to.
Sorry.
No, it's all good. So I'll try to talk about different parts of it. But I think that that again, going back in context and appreciating that the development of electricity and oil and gas and all the things that the way we developed energy going back the last 150 years has fundamentally changed modern life. It has led to electrification was called the greatest advancement of the 20th century. The ability to refrigerate, heat and cool homes, all those things from the medicines, all of that we're now able to do because of that, let alone all the transportation and information infrastructure. And how we've gotten there, or how we've gotten here, I should say, is not how we're going to go going forward, right? Like we have to change how we source and use energies in ways that are going to be more sustainable for both us and for the planet. And that's something that everybody's working on. The manufacturing community is fully engaged on that at every different level. And that should be where the focus of the public policies and whether it's your state or local governments, federal government, it should be on how do we develop the innovations and how do we develop the technologies that are going to allow us to do that so that we can sustain modern life, sustain the planet, and we're not going to be facing the kind of issues that we are today. That versus the litigation and the continual drumbeat of these cases, it's part of the political push and pull. I mean, if you view this litigation as a political tool, not necessarily as a legal tool, then now it's no longer let's go see if we can get state attorneys general filing claims. A lot of it is let's go get local counties, local some local governments, like Baltimore or whatever. And there's a lot of those, and there's a lot of those that would agree politically with you that they'd like to do something about climate change. They might agree that they'd like to see some money to deal with some climate adaptation costs, and they may agree that they're not a big fan of the oil and gas industry. That doesn't make a litigation, but they're willing to sign on because the foundations and the individuals and the law firms that are behind all of this and funding all of it say it's not going to cost you a dime. You just sign on the dotted line here. We'll take it from here. We just need you to be willing to let us do this in your name. And so a lot of that is what's going on. And so a lot of local governments, don't necessarily aren't getting into the nitty gritty of all the legal theory. They're saying, hey, these guys are offering to do something for free that may give us money at some point. We agree climate change is a problem. Let's just sign and let's see what happens. And if it's bad law, if it's bad whatever, bad policy, we'll deal with that later. And so I think so there's a endless number, presumably, of local governments that might sign on to these things. And the ability to file lawsuits has nothing to do with whether lawsuits are going to be successful. Anybody can file a lawsuit. And they're good at kind of going around and trying to get people to sign on to them.
Well, one point I always try to make when I write about this issue is, the regulation of emissions and air pollution has always been, the federal government has always had primacy on that issue. And there's a reason for that. Because, like you said, we have thousands of cities who could theoretically file these lawsuits in counties. And they're just all sorts of different government entities that do it. But if you end up getting in every jurisdiction a different decision related to liability, then it becomes virtually impossible for companies to do business in the United States if you have to do it in multiple jurisdictions, There's no way you could hope to comply with different regulations in every city and county related to air emissions. And that's why the federal government has always assumed primacy over that. And isn't that really kind of the compelling argument that they were making, the plaintiff or the defendants in the Honolulu case were making in that writ of habeas corpus, right? I mean, that was kind of at the base of seeking relief from the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and if you go back, what you just said is, other than the plaintiffs bringing the cases, is generally considered an accurate representation of what the law is, right? And so
Yeah.
if you go back, to AEP versus Connecticut, the Obama administration filed a brief in that case saying these are not good lawsuits. That these are that the causes of climate change are many. The places where they have, where climate impacts are being felt are many. There's any number of plaintiffs and defendants that could bring these kinds of cases against plaintiffs can bring these kinds of cases, any number of defendants that can be sued. That's why this is not a litigation that is targeted at these people were injured by the wrongful acts of those defendants, right? And so
Right.
because anybody in America or in the world can make that argument against almost anybody else in the world that they've contributed to climate change at some level. And that's what the Obama administration said, and said so. Deciding who to blame for this, I think they said, was capacious. The Trump administration said the same thing when they opposed these lawsuits. They said, state law can't govern this. These are federal issues. This is not a litigation issue, and they opposed the litigation. And just a few months ago, the Biden administration weighed in, and while they did not, they suggested the Supreme Court not grant the review in Honolulu, but they said, for all we know, these will be preempted by the Clean Air Act, or because it's interstate or international emissions, and no state law can govern that. I mean, they've acknowledged the fundamental legal flaw in the entire litigation, but then they told the court, don't hear the case, because whatever. And so that's so whether legal scholars on both sides of the political aisle are largely in agreement that you can't use state law, whether it's in Hawaii or Delaware or New Jersey, to say what is liable inducing conduct, liability inducing conduct in Texas or Kansas or Minnesota or Maine or Europe or China or Russia, because all this is happening all around the world outside of that individual state. And that state can't say, well, we're going to apply our state's law and hold you liable for those things you did everywhere else, which is the fundamental problem that everybody across the aisle, both sides of the aisle, have said is the fundamental problem with this litigation.
So when I look at this issue, I always look at it from the perspective of the oil and gas industry because that's my background. But in reality, NAM certainly represents a lot more sectors of the economy than oil and gas producers, and you wouldn't be mounting this effort through NAM if it wasn't impacting NAM's overall membership. Talk about the kinds of impacts this suite of lawsuits is having on other manufacturers of all kinds of products.
Yeah, absolutely. What the people behind this litigation have acknowledged and have said is that they're using this litigation, they can succeed, is to raise the price of energy on all of us, on consumers, on businesses, families, what have you. Make it more expensive for us to, put gas in our cars, heat and cool our homes, whatever it is that we're going to do. That's going to have a huge impact on the manufacturing community, because manufacturing processes, it involves the use of energy. And if we're going to drive up the cost of energy through this litigation, drive up the cost of manufacturing, it's going to hurt jobs, it's going to hurt our competitiveness globally. And there's not going to be any benefit towards climate change as a result of all this. So we're going to have all these pain points in the labor force and our manufacturing and in international trade and competition for no global benefit. And so that's what's frustrating about all of this, is that if we want to do something about the climate, let's do things that actually are going to help reduce the impacts of climate change and reduce climate change, at the end of the day, to the place where we can we can live on this planet sustainably, and we can maintain our lifestyle, our modern lifestyle at some level, in a sustainable way. And so the manufacturing community, within this specific type of litigation, is very concerned about the impacts of what it can mean for the manufacturing community. But the broader point, kind of where we started this conversation, is this may be against the oil and gas industry today over climate change, but tomorrow, and as you indicated, it might be, certain company manufacturers over, plastics production or over other things. Anytime that there's a social issue or political issue that anyway involves, products or companies that do things, where this litigation would say just go sue the companies and try to get the policy you want through the litigation process, rather than having to go through the checks and balances of the regulatory and legislative processes. And that's just not how that's not how we're supposed to do business in this country.
Well, it's not, but it seems to be the way it's all going, doesn't it? Listen, we're running up against time, but I wanted to give you a chance before we close up here, to let everyone know where they can find more information about your project, the National Association of Manufacturers, and become more involved.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the Manufacturers Accountability Project. We're online. We've got a website. We've got materials on there about the litigation, explaining much of the things that we talked about today. But a lot of times it's talking to people in your communities or state legislators, whoever it is, and just say this doesn't seem right, and I don't want my bills going up, so that somebody can bring these lawsuits. And the lawyers, by the way, would pull 25% for their own pocket, right? I mean, the lawyers are bringing this, so not all this money would actually go to any kind of climate adaptation or the things that they say this litigation is about. There's a huge part of it that goes in the pocket of the people who are bringing the litigation. They've got a lot at stake.
Yeah.
And so, if we want to do something about these issues, there's much more efficient and better ways to do it. And we have a lot of that information on our website.
Well, Phil, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. This is great information that people need to have. And I wish you the best of luck. I hope you're very successful.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. And thank you for having me on. And I didn't realize you were on hiatus, but I'm glad the show's back. And
you're my first guest.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us. And thanks to our extraordinary producer, Eric Perel, and the folks at the Sandstone Group for producing this podcast. I'm David Blackmon, and that's all for now.